Welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show on the Mutual Broadcasting System. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim, and anyone who can remember back to November 22nd, 1963, can remember where he or she was when the news flashed that President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. But 30 years, dozens of hearings, and thousands of books later, there is no consensus on whether Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman or the scapegoat in a far-reaching conspiracy. My guest, Gerald Posner, thinks he has resolved this great murder mystery in Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. It is published by Random House and is a heavily annotated, well-documented reinvestigation of the subject. His book has been hailed by the likes of writers William Styron and Tom Wicker, and we will let you be the judge when we take your phone calls about an hour from now. Welcome.
Thank you for having
my
me.
apologies, because during the promos I pronounced it Posner. I'm sure it's a common mistake, but
no problem.
Posner it is. You were only 9 years old when JFK was assassinated.
Right.
Why the interest? Where did the fascination come in for you?
I had always been almost interested in the case, but increasingly so when after university, I went to Berkeley as a political science major, and then I went on to law school. And at the time I was in law school in California, the House Select Committee in Washington was doing its reinvestigation of the Kennedy and King assassinations, and I followed it closely in the press. That spurred me on to start to read the books on the assassination, many of them. And by definition, they were conspiracy books because that's all that was being published in the late 70s.
Something like 2,000 books have been written about JFK.
Yeah, including self-published books. And it's an astonishing number. Literally, I think 3 or 4 concluded that Oswald did it. And of those, 3 were written by Warren Commission members. 1 by Gerald Ford and 2 by David Bellin, the counsel for the Warren Commission. So there's almost been an onslaught of only one side presented on this. And as I read the books, Carol, I always thought there was a good story here because the books contradicted each other one to the other. I knew they all couldn't be correct. And what I wanted to do was get an opportunity from a publisher to say, go ahead, put on both your hats, that as an attorney and as an investigator, and go out and re-examine the evidence and shake out all the junk from the historical record, push out the material that debunk the material that's garbage, and in the end come up with a primer that you could say to the American public, read this book before you read other Kennedy assassination books. Here's the credible evidence in the Kennedy case. Here are the 4 or 5 issues we still need to resolve and need further investigation. But as I started to do this investigation, I came to conclusions, and this book was never intended to be as conclusionary as it is. But in the end, I was convinced that the evidence was there not just to say, here's the credible evidence, but to actually say, here's what happened, as you called it in your introduction, in this murder mystery.
Well, before we go any further, we're going to let our audience know, we're not giving the book away when we say that Gerald Posner's conclusion is that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. Where was the seed for that conclusion? Just simply on weeding out evidence?
Here are my biases when I start. We all start with biases about the Kennedy case, no question about that. My biases, I never thought it was the government. From my earliest time, as a poli-sci major, I view the government as basically inefficient and bungling. Never thought they were good enough to pull off something like this and then keep it a secret for 30 years. If I lean toward any conspiracy, the theory that I deal with the most is the theory that the mafia may have been behind it primarily because of Jack Ruby. That was my suspicion. Or I thought it was possible for Oswald to have been part of what I call a kitchen conspiracy. 3 or 4 of his friends who knew his politics, knew he was violent, egged him on to do it, and then when he killed the president, they went, oh my God, he did it, and they stayed quiet for 30 years knowing the ramifications if they came out.
We're going to pick up on that thought. My guest, Gerald Posner, the book Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. Back with more after these messages. Music from the movie JFK, which I'm sure is going to come up in this conversation at some point. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. My guest, Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, published by Random House. By the way, if you want to order the book, it is on our toll-free number, 1-800-831-8900. You can charge it to any major credit card. You can call day or night, and it will be signed by the author, and quite a book it is. Before the break, we were talking, Gerald, about the seeds of your interest and the seeds of your own conclusion, which was that Oswald was the lone gunman, and you started off with a couple of premises that maybe there was mob involvement if there was a conspiracy, and that maybe it was Oswald and a few of his friends. How did you winnow it down just to Oswald?
Well, it was very important to me that the conspiracy not be large. In my view, the larger the conspiracy, when it starts to involve hundreds of conspirators, then it's very unlikely that it stayed a secret for so many years without it ever unraveling at some point. So I viewed it as
someone's bound to talk somewhere
absolutely,
along the line.
And slip up somewhere along the way. We know this. I mean, it's one of the reasons the conspiracies just don't work in the end. Things like Watergate and that do unravel Iran-Contra, even when they're relatively small. So I knew it was a small number. But as I went back, what I did on this, Carol, I tried to do. So I went back to original witnesses. I interviewed almost 200 here. I went back to original documents. One of the problems, I think, that's happened in the Kennedy assassination field is that you have authors that do two things. First of all, they make up their mind when they start their work as to what their conclusion is, and then they go out to prove it. So they say, I believe the mob killed Kennedy, or the CIA did, or the KGB, and there is so much evidence out there. And when I say evidence, I use that term loosely. There are so many witnesses that have come forward over the years. There are more people today that claim they were at Dealey Plaza than could have fit at Dealey Plaza at the time. So my point is, you can't just go...
Everybody wants to get into the act.
Right, absolutely. Like, what did we have recently with Diet Pepsi? 17 people standing up and saying, I had a hypodermic in the bottle, and then no one did.
But you drew no conclusions when you started.
No, and so what I did is I went back, and as I started to do the work, it was about halfway through my research that I was convinced then that the evidence was pointing toward Oswald in an overwhelming manner. And I remember when I went back to my publisher at Random House, and I said, I don't think any longer it's a book that's just going to draw conclusions about the evidence. I think you can say what happened in this case, and you can say who did the killing. And they said, yes, and I said, and it's Oswald. And there's this moment almost of silence as they
pregnant
said...
pause.
Right, they said... And what's new about that, right? Isn't that what we heard from the Warren Commission? Then I told them what I thought was new, and then they got excited about it eventually. But it was very interesting how, initially their reaction was, my God, all this work and it's Oswald.
The Warren Commission did conclude that Oswald was the lone gunman. What is new?
Well, I disagree with the Warren Commission quite a bit, as a matter of fact,
right.
And this is very important. The people hear the conclusion and they assume this is a rubber stamp of the Commission or it's a rehash of the Commission's work. Not at all. The Commission made major errors. They did a lot of work. I give them credit for this in a very short amount of time. Lyndon Johnson pushed them at a blistering pace. He wanted their report initially out before the political conventions of 1964. They didn't make that, but they condensed an amazing amount of work in a short time. However, little things that they did wrong that came back to haunt them after. When the FBI redid the shooting experiments for them, they had a tower 30 feet tall. Oswald was actually 60 feet tall on the 6th floor. They shot at stationary targets instead of moving targets. They didn't use the autopsy x-rays and photos, giving in to the wishes of the Kennedy family that didn't want the material used in the final report, and that made the doctors recall things from memory, and they made mistakes. The FBI lied to the Warren Commission. They withheld information that Oswald had given them a note shortly before the assassination that said, stop bothering my wife. They had destroyed it, and they never told the Commission about that. It came out in the mid-'70s. The CIA lied about the fact that they had been in partnership with the Mafia to kill Fidel Castro. So there were things that when they later came out, combined with what I call our later mistrust of government, Watergate and Iran-Contra and Vietnam, that we viewed these things not just as errors, but now we view them as evidence of cover-up and conspiracy.
My guest is Gerald Posner. The book is Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. If you want to order it, you can do so by calling 1-800-831-8900. Gerald, we've just got a few seconds before the break, but the most intriguing part of your book for me was about Oswald's history himself. He was a tortured young man. I want to talk about that. We're running very close to the break, but I want to get to that when we get back and talk about the young Oswald and why you think that history led to the to November 22nd, 1963. I'm Carol Preston, in for Jim Bohannon, and we'll be back after these messages. More sounds, shall we say, from Oliver Stone's JFK. My guest, Gerald Posner, the new book, Lee Harvey Oswald, I should say Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. And Gerald Posner informs me that the book is going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, number 11, the new list coming out. Very controversial. Were you surprised that the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman would generate so much interest?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually thought this was quite an unsensational conclusion in the end, because what it really said to us is, this is right, there's been no story for 30 years. The Warren Commission had it right, maybe for the wrong reasons, and for 30 years we've been looking for the second gunman, and it turns out the story is much simpler. And I was afraid that people might say, so what? What else is... What I underestimated is, what I mentioned to you during the break, is the fact that this is maybe the most controversial position after 30 years.
The story seems to be Lee Harvey Oswald, though. It reads like a dime store novel,
Yeah.
his life. It is unbelievable. Let us talk about the young Oswald and what you found out about him.
Yeah, you know, Carol, I think you're so right on this. To me, this is the key to the case. As you know, I spent half the book on it. The first 300 pages is all about Oswald's life, and I can't emphasize enough how important I think that is. He became the story to me, and I think that the answers to the question of why Jack Kennedy dies in Dallas in November 63 are to be found in this young man's tortured existence. Remember, he was only 24 at the time of the assassination.
Right.
We think of him as 30-something, but he had just turned 24. And he grew up, here's somebody who moved 21 times by the time he was 16, had been to 12 different schools, had trouble adapting time and time again to those schools, never had any real friends, had a streak toward violence, used to punch his mother in the face, chased his brother with a butcher knife, pulled a knife on his stepsister, his sister-in-law, and at the age of 13, when a psychiatrist in New York interviewed him because he'd been a truant from school, the psychiatrist concluded that he had passive-aggressive personality disorder with schizoid features and a tendency toward danger and violence. He joins the Marines at 17, sort of this aimless life, and ends up a terrible experience. His colleagues think that he's gay. They push him in the shower. They call him Mrs. Oswald. They taunt him all the time. He's court-martialed twice, once for attacking an officer and once for shooting himself in the arm with a weapon he's not supposed to have. He gets a fixation on Russia. He has this half-baked political philosophy of communism and anarchism and thinks Russia is the goal. Defects over there when he gets out of the Marines, and turns out that they tell him to leave. They don't want him.
There's nothing that this man could do right in his entire life.
Except the Kennedy assassination, which is one of those things when you actually look at it, and when we get to it, it's almost the serendipity that finally, for the first time in his life, everything does break correctly for him, even that final shot that just catches Kennedy in the top of the head. Because you're absolutely right when you say nothing works for him. I mean, he tries to kill himself. He can't succeed at that in Russia. 2 Soviet psychiatrists interview him and say he's mentally unstable. He marries a young Russian girl, comes back to the States. It's a terrible marriage. He's beating her all the time. He now comes with his political philosophy, the idea that his goal in life will be served by the murder of one person, and that's going to be a retired Army general in Dallas, Edwin Walker, who was a right-wing general. Oswald plans a whole campaign around this assassination attempt, and it goes awry. As you say, another thing failed. The bullet grazes along a window frame and just misses Walker's head. He moves to New Orleans after that and sets up his own pro-Castro organization and distributes hundreds or thousands of leaflets on the street and can't get one member. And finally decides, I've given up on the United States. I've given up on all this waste. I can't hold a job. The FBI's harassing me. And he decides to move to Cuba, his new goal of where Nirvana is to be found, and goes down to Mexico City, and they turn him away. Yet another failure in his life. So when he comes back to Dallas, October and November of 1963, right before Jack Kennedy comes down there, he's a life literally out of control.
This is an explosion waiting to happen.
No question. And I view Jack Kennedy very much as a target of opportunity. Here's a man who thinks that his goals will be served by killing Edwin Walker. And on November 19th, in 2 Dallas newspapers, the exact details of a motorcade route that will take President Kennedy right in front of where Oswald works in the Texas School Book Depository are printed in the paper. And this is literally history being served up on a platter. Here's a man, from my view of Oswald, that could have been in a 6th-floor window in Moscow shooting at Nikita Khrushchev. It was not left-wing politics that made him go after Jack Kennedy. It wasn't a personal hatred toward Jack Kennedy. It was a man who at that point hated authority and hated the government in both countries and was willing to throw a cog into the machine. And this was suddenly the biggest cog he could throw in, and here was the opportunity he took advantage of.
Do you think if he had been successful in the Walker assassination attempt, that there would have been a Kennedy assassination?
Question as to whether Marina, his wife, who did not turn him in because of the failed attempt, might have felt compelled to turn him in after Walker. Or if Oswald, I think, was successful with Walker, yes, there would have been a Kennedy assassination, because then he would have thought of himself as even more invincible. He still mocked the police authorities. Marina says this, that he thought the police were totally useless in Dallas. They weren't sure what the bullet was that was fired because it had been mangled. They had thought there were getaway cars from the Walker scene he had actually left on foot. He laughed about these things, and he thought they were very inefficient. So brave was he and so cocky in this attitude that even though he had never really succeeded in anything, he thought he was better than others, that he was brighter than others, although his IQ was just about at 100. And he was convinced he could get away from the Kennedy assassination, and lo and behold, he does. It's amazing. But 3 minutes after he shoots Jack Kennedy, he walks out the front door of the depository and he's off back to his rooming house.
Giving Robert McNeil directions.
Yeah, right.
To the nearest phone booth.
One of the great misscoops of the case, Robert McNeil, then a young reporter for NBC, runs up the depository steps and asks a man who's running out where the phones are, and this fellow points over to the side. And later, Oswald, when caught by the police, said that he ran into a Secret Service agent on the step of the depository. It turns out McNeil then had a blonde crew cut and had his press identification badge on, and Oswald misinterpreted that as a Secret Service agent.
I was fascinated about your accounts of Oswald's mother. I couldn't help but thinking of Adolf Hitler, believe it or not, because his father had died. She was the overbearing, protective mother, and no matter what was said about him, in her own way, she defended and protected him.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, as you know, I've done books before on Nazi war criminals, and it's interesting that you make that analogy because I could easily see that, not comparing Oswald to Hitler, obviously, but in terms of the overbearing and protective mother, there's absolutely a very clear comparison there. And she was, Marguerite Oswald, somebody, Lee slept with her in their bed up to the time he was 11. She watched over him. She said, stay home from school. You are smarter and better than other children. Stay home alone and read. You can't get in trouble that way. Don't play sports. You won't be hurt. Instead, try tap dancing. And even before the Warren Commission, after the time that her son has killed the president, not only did she maintain that he was innocent, she was the one who first came up with the idea that he might have been an agent for American intelligence because she thought he was clever enough for that. But they asked her about the things like, what about the time that he pulled a knife on his sister-in-law? And she said, well, it was a small knife, really. And, of course, he didn't use it. Then they said, but didn't he beat Marina? And he did beat Marina mercilessly. As a matter of fact, neighbors thought at times he would kill her. And Marguerite's answer was, well, there are times that a woman needs a black eye. So, even at that point, she couldn't bring herself to condemn her son's excesses.
Very quickly, in the next several seconds, I want to touch on his stay in the Marines and the marksmanship. There has been some controversy as to whether he was indeed a good shot. You have concluded that he did develop the expertise.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, his records in the Marines show that he was not only a marksman and a sharpshooter and was capable of doing very good shooting, but the key question is what was his capability by the time 63 came around, and was quite good. And Marina talks about the fact that he went out and practiced with a rifle quite often.
My guest is Gerald Posner. The book is Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. It is published by Random House. When we come back from the break, I want you to walk us through November 22nd, 1963, Dealey Plaza, the book depository, and the whole scenario for the assassination and how your conclusions were drawn that Lee Harvey Oswald indeed was the lone gunman. If you'd like to order the book, you can call 1-800-831-8900, charge it to Visa or MasterCard any day, any time of day or night. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon, and we'll be back with Gerald Posner and JFK on the Mutual Broadcasting System. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim, and this is the Mutual Broadcasting System. Fascinating guest and conversation tonight with author Gerald Posner, a former Wall Street lawyer, I might add, turned author. He's authored a number of books, and his latest, about to hit the New York Times bestseller list at number 11, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. And Gerald Posner concludes that Lee Harvey Oswald indeed was the lone assassin of John Fitzgerald Kennedy some 30 years ago, and I am sure that you have raised the ire of conspiracists, conspiracy theorists around the world.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you that I'm glad to have a debate with anybody on the facts. I list, as you know, some 80 pages at the end of what I think are source notes, so that everything that I say in here, you can find out what I base my conclusions on, and if you don't agree with it, you can go back to the original sources. But there are people who take this very personally, who have essentially spent 20 years believing it's a conspiracy, and it's almost as if it were a religion for them, and get quite angry when they hear that I've concluded this, and don't necessarily have a discussion on the facts. I've received quite angry calls accusing me of having been paid by the FBI or the CIA or somebody to write this book. Speaking of which, we will be taking your calls about a half hour from now, and I am sure that there are many people who want to express their concerns and comments, and they have their own theories. But what I'd like to do right now is have you walk us through November 22nd, 1963, and Dealey Plaza, the events surrounding it, the book depository, and in the process explain to us, what leads you to the conclusion that Oswald was the lone gunman. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, Carol, there's some interesting new information about Dealey Plaza that comes from an old source, the so-called home movie of the assassination, the Zapruder film, a film taken by Abraham Zapruder that's been used many times. It shows the entire sequence of shots fired at Dealey. But what I've done here is utilize illustrations made by a firm in California that's done new computer enhancement work and animation work. That's been available They did it for the American Bar Association in 1992, as a matter of fact.
This is very new.
Right.
This isn't cutting edge. This is cutting
edge technology. Is the latest material. And here's what really happens. It's very interesting. Oswald gets to the book depository on that morning, on Friday morning, driven by a friend who's driven him out from his wife's staying out in Irving, Texas. And he has with him in the back seat of the car what he calls curtain rods to his friend, wrapped in a brown paper bag, and he takes those into the depository. And that's, in fact, where he has his dismantled Mannlicher Carcano, an Italian World War II vintage rifle. And he is working in the Texas School Book Depository, which is on the edge of a 3-acre public square in downtown Dallas called Dealey Plaza. And it is through that plaza that the president's motorcade will pass that day. Now, we've heard sometimes from conspiracy buffs that the motorcade was changed at the last moment. Oliver Stone said this in the film JFK. There was some route change that brought the car closer to Oswald. Absolutely not true. It was published in 2 Dallas newspapers for the first time on November 19th, 3 days before JFK arrived. And the route was always the same. It came down Main Street right to the heart of downtown Dallas, where the big throngs of crowds were, made a right turn at the edge of Dealey Plaza along Houston Street, went 1 block right toward the book depository where Lee Oswald worked, and then made a turn right in front of there, a left turn, and went down onto the freeway, went down Elm Street. So Oswald gets inside there, and a number of people see him on the 6th floor, which is where the shots were fired from afterwards, and the rifle was found at about noon. Now, the president's car comes by at 12:30, and at that point, Oswald is left alone on the 6th floor as 6 other co-workers go downstairs for lunch. And one other co-worker goes up. He has a quick lunch there on the 6th floor, and he doesn't see him because what Oswald has constructed in the southeast corner with a view that overlooks all of Dealey Plaza is what I call a sniper's nest. Stacks of boxes high enough so he can't be seen by anybody else who comes on the floor, and he's positioned himself in this corner. This is very interesting, in accord with his best shooting scores in the Marines. From the standing position in the Marines, Oswald was a terrible shot. He didn't hit the target. But in the crouch position, he would hit 48 or 49 out of 50 consistently. What does he set up in the window? He sets up a position sitting on a box with boxes bracing the rifle in a crouched position looking straight down Elm Street where the car will turn.
But what about the argument from conspiracy buffs or any student of this that security that day seemed to be conveniently lacking?
Right. I'm so glad you raised that. As a matter of fact, what I did is I went back and I examined other motorcades that had taken place in 61, 62, and 63 for Jack Kennedy, and I said, is this motorcade in fact different in terms of security? And what I found out is it is not. We are applying 1993 standards of security and Secret Service protection to 1963. In fact, Jack Kennedy had been in other cities with the bubble top removed from the car, with no Secret Service agents riding on the rear of the president's car, and Secret Service agents were never posted in buildings in those days with rifles or on top of roofs as they are today. So
and they didn't worry about open windows or closed windows?
It's astonishing. No. So it is lax, but by today's standards, not by 1963 standards. Now, what happens at 12:30, and this is key, is as the motorcade comes by and Jack Kennedy starts to go down Elm Street in this car, 3 shots are fired. On this one issue, there's more agreement with the witnesses at Dealey Plaza than on any other single issue. Of the almost 200 people who gave statements about the source of shots, 88% said they heard 3 shots and 3 shots only. And the Warren Commission bungled this. They said that Oswald only had 4.8 to 5.6 seconds to fire all 3. Now, that's the bare minimum. The FBI sent marksmen afterwards to try to repeat that feat, and they barely made it. They averaged 5.6 seconds, 2 hits out of 3 on the target. And then CBS took 11 volunteer marksmen and had them do it, and they averaged 5.5 seconds, 2 hits out of 3 on a target. So people rightly said, my God, if some of the best marksmen around could barely do that in 5.5 seconds, how did Lee Harvey Oswald, a mediocre shooter, accomplish it? What we now know is Oswald had over 8.5 seconds to fire the 3 shots. This is
through the computer enhancement of the film.
And here's what it shows, is as the president's car turns in front of Oswald's building, the Texas School Book Depository, onto Elm Street, he has to make a very quick decision. If he doesn't fire quickly, the car will disappear under the cover of a tree that will block his view for nearly 2 seconds. So he has to fire the first shot before what is frame 166 on the Zapruder film. And if you look at the Zapruder film, we now see visual evidence of the response to that first shot, which is fired much earlier than anyone thought, which misses. We see a little girl running along the side of the street, Rosemary Willis. She turns around at that moment and looks up toward the depository. When asked why, she said, I heard the first shot. Governor Connolly turns around in the car. When asked why, and looking back toward the depository, he heard the first shot.
That's in a subsequent...
Right at these times, 162, 163, they're all reacting at the same time, and so does Jackie. She swivels her head around, and the president stops waving. What I call the visual evidence. That shot is deflected by a tree branch, goes out 520 feet from the depository, hits a curb, and wounds a bystander, James Tague. The second shot is fired 3.5 seconds after that, the so-called magic bullet that goes through President Kennedy's back, high neck, shoulder, through his throat, and goes on to wound Governor Connolly. We can talk about the so-called magic bullet in a second. The third shot is fired a full 5 seconds after the second, at frame 313. And the reason I use frame numbers here is the Zapruder film is our time clock for the assassination. It's 18 frames to a second. So depending on where you see the activity taking place on the film, you can measure how much time is transpiring by counting the frames.
Right, but those determinations weren't able to be made without
this degree of
computer.
specificity, because we now can see enhancements that make the film different. So this is interesting. What Oswald actually has in terms of time is 8.4 seconds to fire 2 shots. People forget this. The first shot is already in the rifle. The bullet's in the chamber. So when he fires that rifle shot, it starts the time clock running.
Right.
So he then has over 8 seconds to do 2 shots.
To load the other 2.
Right. And it's a fraction of a second to operate the both. So in terms of timing, it's very clear that he has the timing to do the 3 shots.
Fascinating. My guest, Gerald Posner, The Book Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. Back with more after these messages. Music from the movie JFK. That was Oliver Stone's movie based on Jim Garrison's attempt to crack this case. My guest is Gerald Posner, and he feels that he has cracked it through Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. By the way, I want to mention that his lovely wife, Tricia, has joined us in the studio. She is your researcher, is that
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely
and
right.
The Posners worked day and night, they say, for 3 years on this book. We're going to be taking your calls in about 20 minutes at 703-418-1500 for Gerald Posner, and I know that there are a lot of students of the JFK assassination out there, and you'll be loaded with questions and comments for Gerald Posner. Before the break, you gave us the rundown of the 3 bullets, and through computer enhancement of the Zapruder film, figured that Lee Harvey Oswald indeed had much more time than was originally thought to fire off those 3 bullets. It is the second bullet, the so-called magic bullet, that has, I guess, raised the most controversy and been called the most into question because of its entry, through JFK and Connolly and heads moving the wrong way. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that even those people who don't find the conspiracy theorists have made a case for conspiracy sometimes back off of thinking that it's Oswald alone, because they know that means they have to accept the so-called magic bullet, and they just can't accept it. The bullet's been so denigrated over time. I mean, Oliver Stone in JFK, talking of the devil, mocked it in a wonderful way. He said the bullet made a right turn, a left turn, went down, went up. It hesitated for a second and a half in midair. It's the smartest bullet ever fired. So, people listen to that and they think, my God, how did the Warren Commission, how were they ever so silly to accept that? The Warren Commission came to it almost as a process of elimination. They knew that there was no way that Oswald could get off the shots in the necessary time unless one bullet wounded both Kennedy and Connolly. But they couldn't prove it from affirmative evidence. Now, with this new work, I believe that the magic bullet is proved with incontrovertible evidence. They needed no magic, and here's why. It used to be a guessing game, Carol. People said, I wonder when Kennedy and Connolly were hit. Maybe they were hit here on the road. Maybe they were hit behind the sign. Maybe they had a delayed reaction. You can see Kennedy's hands moving up near his throat. That's an instinctive response, a neurological response. You can see Connolly at a certain point in the frames 230 collapsing as his lung collapses and he falls over. But the question was, were they hit earlier? All the guesswork is now taken out. Last year in California, in 1992, a computer technician discovered something that nobody had seen in thousands of viewings of the Zapruder film. He noticed that at frame 224, Governor Connolly's suit lapel, his right lapel, flaps forward. Now, what is interesting about that is experts who have examined Governor Connolly's suit, forensics experts back at the National Archives, tell me, and the photos show it as well, that is where the bullet passed through as it went through the governor. So we've now been able to isolate the point on the film when the bullet actually passes through Connolly.
There's nothing else that could have made his lapel flap forward?
The car's moving into the wind. The wind is coming at gusting at 15 to 20 miles into him. And it's not just a movement. When I say flaps forward, it's not as though the suit just moves forward as though he rustled. It comes fully forward and covers his complete shirt area on his right-hand side. And a bullet passing at some 1,700 feet a second, 1,400 feet as it's leaving that, pushes it forward. And what's interesting is that's where you find the bullet hole when you go back to his suit at the National Archives. Now, what's key about this is by taking out the guessing from the timing of the shot, you have to ask yourself only one question. You put the governor and the president into the positions they were in the car based upon the Zapruder film at frames 223 and 224. And you can then ask the important question to a computer and you can look at it. Were these two men in a position so that one shot could inflict the 7 wounds on both of them? And actually, it turns out, and I have diagrams of this in the book, it's a straight line trajectory. The bullet goes directly through Kennedy's high neck shoulder, exits his neck. It's tumbling at this point. We know that by the size of the entrance wound on Connolly's back. It enters sideways. It goes through his chest. And when it comes out his right nipple, he is turned around a little bit to the right in his seat because he's previously turned to look back toward the president. He's now in the process of turning back toward the middle. His right arm is held up in front of his chest, holding a Stetson hat. The bullet tumbles out under his right nipple and goes straight through his right wrist, which is held in front of the chest, and then goes down and plops into his left thigh, which in the position that he's turned in the car is a straight line.
The bullet could continue to tumble after passing through
and here's the
two
key.
bodies?
Right, and here's the key, Carol. You just asked the key thing. Could it continue to tumble? The second part of the question that's always befuddled people on this single bullet is how could it emerge in such good condition? It was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital in relatively good condition, just flattened slightly with some of the lead core pushed out. The reason is what you just said. As it passed through the bodies, the Warren Commission missed it, the House Select Committee missed it. Ballistics experts now know, and it makes sense when you look back on it, that a bullet slows up as it passes through other parts of the body. So it's fired at 2,000 feet a second from Oswald's rifle. It's hitting Kennedy at about 1,800 feet a second. And now we can calculate how much it slows up as it goes through Kennedy's mass, based upon his weight. It doesn't hit any bone. And when it goes through Connally, it exits his chest and goes into his wrist at about 900 feet a second. It's slowing up the entire time as it goes through body parts. Fast enough to break bone, but not fast enough to deform the bullet. When it goes into his thigh, it's at about 400 feet a second, fast enough to pop under the skin and not much else. The key to this is that last year, again, 1992, ballistics tests were done to test this and see if this theory could become a fact. 6.5 millimeter bullets, just like Oswald used in the assassination.
How was it tested?
Their charge was reduced so that it was fired at 1,100 feet a second into a cadaver's wrist. I reproduced photos of this in the book. The bullet has emerged in better condition than the one found on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital. For years, conspiracy theorists said it was impossible to break a bone as thick as Connally's wrist bone and have the bullet emerge in good condition. You can do it all day long now. The key is that the bullet slows up as it passes through the two bodies.
Connally was buried with bullet fragments. Would it have shed some light had he allowed those fragments to be removed?
Yes and no. I'm a big believer that the fragments should have been taken out and tested. I think the documents should be released in this case. I'm a full believer in full disclosure. Let's get the evidence out in all ways, and I think that would have been helpful. But what people forget is Connally had 3 fragments buried with him, but he also had 3 removed in an operation in 1963 when the doctor took them out, and those were tested by the House Select Committee in 1978, the same test, and those were matched to 100% to the single bullet found on the stretcher. So the test was done. The Connally fragments have already been tested and matched the bullet. What conspiracy theorists were saying recently when Connally was buried is, we don't like the test results before. Let's try it again and get the new fragments out of him and try it once more.
We have an awful lot of ground to cover in our few remaining minutes before we start taking your phone calls at 703-418-1500. We should talk about Jack Ruby, among other things, and his motivation, right. And we hope to get to that after the break. My guest, Gerald Posner, the book Case Closed, published by Random House. I'm Carol Preston, sitting in for Jim Bohannon. Back with more after these messages. Music from Oliver Stone's JFK, which was certainly one of the major conspiracy theories, debunked by my guest, Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. You know, John Kennedy, by the time he was in his third year of the presidency, was hated by a lot of groups. The military was upset because they thought he was a dove and that he was getting too friendly with the Soviet Union. JFK was making his mark on the CIA. Bobby Kennedy, certainly, and the mob connection. I mean, there were a lot of groups. I mean, what's to say that there wasn't a conspiracy?
Carol, I'm so glad you raised the point. As a matter of fact, I have an unusual position on this. I happen to say there well could have been conspiracies brewing against Jack Kennedy in 62 or 63, because I agree with you. The mob hated him. They thought he was trying to bust up the mafia right and left. I wouldn't be surprised if you could produce a tape recording that showed Carlos Marcello sitting around with his henchmen in New Orleans and saying, let's get that no-good president. The same thing with the anti-Castro Cubans or any number of groups. But what I'm saying in this book is I've examined Oswald's connections very carefully. I followed the trail of the money. There is none. I've looked at the telephone records. I looked at his acquaintances and friends. I talked to his wife. There is no credible evidence to tie Lee Harvey Oswald into any of these potential plotters.
He was nobody's patsy.
That's right. He beat all of them to Jack Kennedy. They would have given him a medal. They would have clapped him on the back. But we assume in this country, because X group hated the president and may have even wanted him dead, that therefore Oswald was their man. But absolutely not true. That's where I draw the distinction. Oswald was the loner who acted on his own, although other groups may have celebrated Jack Kennedy's death and may have even been plotting their own actions against him.
But what about Jack Ruby? And what's in his history that made him come and gun Oswald down on global television?
Let me tell you, I think Jack Ruby has done such a disservice to history because he's the basis, in my view, for so much of the conspiracy speculation. You know, we have James Earl Ray today in jail, having killed King, and he says, by the way, it was a conspiracy. This mysterious fellow Raoul was really the guy who led me into it, but we don't we don't really listen to him because James Earl Ray had his day in court. The evidence was presented and we saw it. Lee Harvey Oswald never had that opportunity. Here he is gunned down by a man with mob connections. I think the Warren Commission made an error and underplayed his mob connections. He was at the jail repeatedly over the weekend and he never had his opportunity to tell his story in public. Ruby I examine in detail. I look at his life also in a microcosm. And Ruby is very much this very violent personality who grows up in the south side of Chicago, turns out to have been somebody arrested a dozen times down in Dallas, used to beat up his patrons at the club, chases a business partner with a gun. And Ruby, to me, is not somebody who killed Lee Harvey Oswald because of patriotism. Not his excuse. He said, I want to save Jackie a trip back to Dallas. Ruby was there Friday night at the jail when Oswald was arrested. Oswald walks a few feet in front of him. Ruby has his gun with him. He never makes a move to kill Oswald on Friday night when he's first there. Now imagine that the mob has given a contract to Jack Ruby to eliminate Lee Harvey Oswald from the conspiracy to kill the president.
Why?
They're not going to give him a contract to fill at his own leisure. Certainly he's going to kill him at his first opportunity, but Friday when he has the chance, he never makes a move toward Oswald. On Sunday, he goes downtown and sends a MoneyGram to a stripper of his, $25 MoneyGram. Oswald was supposed to have been transferred an hour earlier from the jail, but he wasn't because the interview ran over, the interrogation. Then Oswald asked for a change of clothes. It delayed him again. Ruby walks down the block after having his receipt time-stamped at 11:17 for sending the MoneyGram to a stripper. He shoots Oswald at 11:21. He walks down a ramp as a policeman is distracted as a police car pulls out of the jail. He arrives, witnesses say, some 15 to 20 seconds before Lee Harvey Oswald walks in front. I'm convinced from my understanding of Jack Ruby that he thinks he's going to be a hero. Ruby never thinks he's going to spend a day in jail. He has just eliminated the stain from Dallas. He shot a person that weekend everybody hates, Lee Oswald. The police are going to clap him on the back and say, Jack, you did a great thing. And Carol, what's interesting is there were hundreds of people gathered in front of the jail to watch Oswald transferred that morning. When the word spread out onto the street that he had been shot, the crowd broke spontaneously into applause and cheers. It's a very chilling scene to see today. We forget the amount of animosity directed toward Oswald and the great sympathy for the Kennedy family. Ruby thought that he would be a hero from this.
You think America's obsession with the assassination of JFK is it directly linked to Jack Ruby's act?
Well, in large part. I mean, some of it by the mistakes by the Warren Commission and the fact that we've had 30 years of just conspiracy theories presented and that we've lost faith in government. But Ruby to a great extent. If you did not have Ruby involved in here, I think it would be very different. If Hinckley, for instance, had been 1 inch over with his shot, Reagan is dead. If somebody had killed Hinckley 2 days later in police custody who later had mob connections, we would also be wondering the very same things we did in the Kennedy case.
And Hinckley did it for the love of an actress.
Right.
My guest is Gerald Posner, who is ready to take on your phone calls at 703-418-1500. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show. I'm Carol Preston, and this is the Mutual Broadcasting System. About the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, coming up on the 30th anniversary this November. My guest is Gerald Posner, author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, in which Posner concludes, very authoritatively, that Oswald indeed was the lone gunman. And you say that 9 more books are coming out over the next several months?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, 9 books this fall, all of them conspiracy books.
Well, it should be interesting, to say the least. Let's get right to the phone calls. And first up, we say hello to Monterey, California.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Mr. Posner, I certainly respect the work that you've done, and it might even be the definitive work on the subject. Here's my problem. Is, first of all, I believe we're trivializing the death of this person. He was a man sitting next to his wife who happened to have his head blown off and his brain splattered all over her nice pink suit. Don't we owe them a bit of consideration by not continually dragging this out? There's nothing we can do to bring him back. And to keep replaying the event, it seems to me, does more harm than good.
That's a good question.
Well,
Gerald?
I must tell you that I am actually extremely sensitive to the fact that sometimes when discussing this, we are talking about these very brutal wounds taking place to the president, and you're right. It takes place inches in front of Jacqueline Kennedy's face. There's a chapter, as a matter of fact, in the book in which she's at Parkland Hospital while they're trying to resuscitate her, and I've had person after person tell me it's absolutely an emotionally wrenching chapter when you see what she went through. And I think it is horrendous, but the only thing I don't agree with is the fact that we do more harm by bringing it up or we don't do any good, and I'll tell you why. I think that a great deal of the loss of faith that we have had as a people in government is the belief that, 80 or 90% of the American public believes there was a conspiracy in this case. They believe that the government may have actually been involved in killing the chief executive. And to the extent that we can restore some semblance of normality, of coming back to the real truth and solving this murder mystery, I think it should end some of the discussion and speculation. I condemn in this book book what I view as the cottage industry that has developed around President Kennedy's death. The fact that there are assassination research centers that exist in shopping malls selling T-shirts and bumper stickers, and that in tabloid papers next to Elvis and Marilyn, we discuss this. So I'm hoping that we can bring this back to a scholarly discussion and put this behind us.
Dayton, Ohio, you're on with Gerald Posner. Hello, Dayton.
Yes, Mr. Posner. I was wondering, I have a problem with the single bullet theory and the fact that in frame 222, there's a bullet hole next to the mirror and that frame, and yet you're saying that Conley was hit at 223, 224.
Let's let Gerald answer the question.
Right. As a matter of fact, what happens is a number of people think, and I have to disagree with you on a bullet hole being available in the mirror on the car or looking at it as 222. A number of people think that they see things on the Zapruder film, including bullet holes in the car, and or some people even think they see the driver, William Greer, turn around with a pistol in his hand and shoot at the president. I've had people say that. In fact, what happens is that car was taken apart by the FBI, who looked at it part by part looking for bullet holes, and there are only two other marks on the car besides the blood that was left by the president, and that is a crack on the windshield from a fragment from the president's headshot that hit after frame 313. We can see shots where the window is clear, and then when there's a crack, that actually cracks the windshield. And in addition, there's a dent on the chrome stripping right by the windshield, also caused by a fragment. If either the windshield or the chrome stripping had been hit on a bullet on the fly at 2,000 feet a second, it would have gone straight through those. So the only two marks on the car, in fact, are caused by fragments from the president's headshot after frame 313.
What are people seeing on the film?
Well, they're seeing, the quality is 8mm, remember. It's not very good. I've even seen versions of this so far down the line, bootleg copies, that the film almost looks black and white. And at one point, I've seen a film version in which it looks like there's a glare in the driver's hand. People say, my God, he's holding a gun, as if nobody else in Dealey Plaza would have seen it.
Let's move on to Springfield, Massachusetts. Hello.
Yes, how about the question of the entrance holes and exit holes, which would contradict the fact that Oswald was the only one shooting?
All right, I'm glad you raised that point. I went back, first of all, in reviewing the autopsy x-rays and photos, and they have been determined as being authentic by 22 photographic experts who compared base x-rays and compared the photos as well for the House Select Committee in the late 1970s. There's only evidence, there's no contradiction of all, of two shots from the rear that hit the president. You can see the hole on the rear of his high neck shoulder that has abrasion wounds. It's clearly an entrance. And the exit hole, of course, is obliterated because a tracheostomy was performed over it in an operation to open up an air passage in Parkland Hospital when they were trying to save the president in Dallas. The head wound is clear. There's a small entrance hole.